rocket, which began as just one man's dream of reaching space, instead turns into Hitler's prized weapon of destruction.
The V-2 was an incredible innovation. It was like no other weapon ever before. It was a ballistic missile. The target would never hear it coming.
A British intelligence officer desperately wants to save London from this most advanced weapon of war.
The amazing thing about the V weapons was that the British discovered their existence just in time to counteract the attack before it developed.
And an American soldier brings home a treasure trove of technology. Knowledge that will eventually be key to helping put man on the moon.
The US hired people involved in Nazi programs that were meant to cause harm and horrible devastation.
At an office of MI6, England's secret intelligence service based in London, Reginald Jones, MI6's principal scientific advisor, is on the way to a staff meeting.
Hello.
Reginald Jones, a young physicist recruited out of university, had been one of the key people working on the air campaign defending Britain.
It's 3 months after D-Day and the invasion of Normandy. The Nazis have been successfully pushed out of France, and Allied forces keep advancing against Hitler's forces on all fronts. The war is going well for the Allies. Back home in Britain, the German aerial attacks have all but ceased. At the same time, across London, in the western suburb of Chiswick, Royal Army engineer Bernard Browning is arriving home for a well-deserved leave from the front.
The British had experienced great tragedies and defeats, and suddenly the war is really, it seems like it's over.
Things have been moving, except possibly for a last parting shot. What is coming to be known as the Battle of London is over.
Browning is on the way to meet his girlfriend at the nearby train station when he stops at a little corner store. He has big plans. He wants to get married as soon as the war is over. For him, the trip back home must feel almost like a new beginning.
What was that?
Staveley Road in Chiswick has been obliterated. Bernard Browning will never have the chance to see his girlfriend. And at this moment, it becomes clear to MI6's Reginald Jones that a new deadly phase has just begun. Reginald Jones has been keeping an eye on the secret German rocket development program. He knows immediately that the Nazis have finally succeeded. But other Londoners who heard the explosion in Chiswick would have assumed that it was just another doodlebug. The Germans had been dropping these flying bombs on London since the summer of '44, but the sound of the doodlebug gave time for a warning.
So 6 days after D-Day, the Allies have landed in Europe. They have their foothold. Their armies are returning to the continent. Comes out of the sky, attacking London, this new weapon, a V-1 flying bomb, this peculiar, buzzing, flying torpedo. There's a very good reason why they were called V-weapons, vengeance weapons, because they always seem to come in response to the Allies gaining the upper hand, both in the return of their armies to the continent and the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany.
The V1, hence its name, Doodlebug could be heard from the noise of its pulse jet. And when that noise cut off, there were a couple of minutes when you could take shelter.
The best way to think about the V-1, the flying bomb, is that it's an early type of cruise missile. It had wings, it was propelled by a pulse jet, it was launched from something that looked like a ski ramp, and the way it worked was it had a certain amount of fuel, it would fly to its target, it was a very crude weapon, and the engine would cut out after a certain amount of time. And that pulse jet would sound like a pounding, so the noise of that's why the Londoners nicknamed it the Doodlebug.
Adolf Hitler had named the bomb the vengeance weapon, his attempt to exact revenge against Britain for Allied bombing raids on the German homeland. The V-1 had only one purpose: terrorize the British population.
As long as the war went well, Hitler wasn't that interested in these Wunderwaffen, miraculous weapons, but as the tide of the war turned, he became more and more interested in these weapons.
Hitler was concerned with the grandiose world-dominating theories that were in his deranged mind. He made sure that people loyal to him were devoted to producing as many weapons as was humanly possible.
Well, the attack, of course, on 8 September was astonishingly different from that of the Doodlebugs. So famously, these weapons, they make this peculiar burping noise, and then the engine cuts out, and then a few moments later, there's an explosion. When the V-2 landed, this thing is hurtling down at supersonic speed, carrying a 1-ton warhead, and shatter a whole district. And the sound of this thing, breaking the sound barrier and exploding, was tremendous. Something new had happened.
It happened.
And Jones, of course, was one of the people in scientific intelligence who was at the center of trying to piece together information about these V weapons.
What do you have? Jose.
Reginald Jones has been collecting intelligence on Hitler's V weapons for much of the war.
There have been plenty of rumors, little bits of intelligence that indicated that the Germans were developing rockets.
Combing through reports from his sources on this day in September, Jones realizes what he feared has finally happened. Hitler has hit London with the next generation of vengeance weapons, a rocket capable of launching from the continent and striking London in less than 5 minutes. The V-2.
They did it. Bloody did it.
September 8, 1944, the first V-2 hits London with a shock because nobody could hear the rocket approaching. It just hit London and it caused a lot of damage, a lot of confusion, and the whole city was taken by surprise.
In a secret weapons factory, the men who built the V-2 are hard at work. Werner von Braun is the 32-year-old German rocket engineer who dreamt up, designed, and built the amazing new weapon. Hitler has placed his trust in the young man. The German army, the Wehrmacht, hopes that the first successful V-2 attack against London will help turn the war in favor of Nazi Germany.
Es hat funktioniert.
Long before his weapon hit London, Werner von Braun had aimed for the moon.
Von Braun was raised in an elite family, but he got interested in spaceflight very early.
As a small boy, he said, "I want to spin the wheel of progress."
Well, he joined an amateur rocket club launching what we would now think of as backyard toys. I have no doubt was probably perceived as a little weird at the time.
And this group of men shooting for the stars caught the attention of famous science fiction film director Fritz Lang.
Movie men like Fritz Lang were interested in the show business angle of launching these toy rockets.
Werner von Braun was hired as an assistant for developing a rocket for Fritz Lang's famous film Frau im Mond, Woman in the Moon.
But von Braun was soon offered a new starring role. The German army hired the young scientist for their rocket department.
They were interested in all sorts of advanced technologies, and they also noticed the small group around Werner von Braun, which was developing rockets.
World War I was finally declared over when the Allied powers forced Germany to sign the Versailles Peace Treaty. The document was intended to drastically limit the power of Germany.
Germany, until Hitler came to power, was still restricted by the Treaty of Versailles and what kinds of weapons it could develop.
Except the Germans found a loophole.
The Versailles Peace Treaty had forbidden weapons like tanks, planes, heavy artillery to Germany. But nobody had thought of mentioning missiles.
Von Braun quickly emerged as a brilliant young man who, even in his early 20s, was capable of leading a huge group. He became a party member in 1937. You could say he was not really a Nazi enthusiast, but he was very much an opportunist going along with the system, and he stated his belief in Hitler several times.
The German army put von Braun to work with leading army officers like Karl Becker and Walter Dornberger to develop what was to become the world's first ballistic missile, an unmanned projectile some would argue by today's standards would be a weapon of mass destruction.
The V-2 was really the most exotic weapon of the war before the atomic bomb.
Wie viele Opfer? Haben wir noch keine Erkenntnisse. Danke.
Werner von Braun has developed a working rocket, and Hitler believes it could be a powerful new weapon. MI6's Reginald Jones has known for months that the Germans were secretly developing the V-2.
British intelligence, there had been a debate about what type of weapon the V weapon would be. And of course, there were multiple V weapons. In a sense, many people were right. So some were arguing really that the V weapon would be, well, a flying bomb. And the attacks on the flying bomb began, of course, in June of 1944. Through an agent in Oslo came a report that was nicknamed the Oslo Report that mentioned the possibility that the Germans were developing rockets for offensive warfare. But it's in March 1943 that British intelligence, eavesdropping on two captured German generals talking about rocketry, that's the moment really when the whole of the intelligence machinery started to focus on looking for V weapons.
The British began receiving more and more intelligence that the Germans had a rocket program in the late 1942, early 1943 timeframe. And in the spring of 1943, RAF photo reconnaissance discovered images of rockets.
And now, the first rocket has hit London.
First V-2 rockets begin to land in London. Those like Reginald Jones, who predicted that the Germans would use rockets, were vindicated.
Before the attack started, a piece of intelligence about the V-2 had come from a remarkable source, a 23-year-old spy, a French woman named Jeannie Rousseau.
Reginald Jones identifies Jeannie Rousseau as one of the key agents providing human intelligence about the V-weapons programs. She's a very interesting character, working as a translator for the Germans, but at the same time listening in on key conversations, including information about the V-weapons programs and passing that information on to the Allies. Sadly, the Germans intercepted her before she could be extracted by British intelligence from the continent.
But before she was captured, the spy managed to send back valuable intel about the V-2 Research Center, a place called Peenemünde. Peenemünde, a sleepy seaside town north of Berlin.
Peenemünde was Nazi Germany's Cape Canaveral. The money poured in, though, after the German army decided to place its rocket program there. A great deal of money poured in. They decided to make it a showcase for Nazi technology. So splendiferous housing was built for the workers. Experimental and developmental infrastructure on a grand scale. There was nothing else like it in the world.
Peenemünde was a military test establishment developing new weapons, but was also a place where engineers and scientists had come who originally had wanted to reach for the stars. They wanted to send rockets into space.
But the German military has different plans. They need missiles, rockets that can carry a warhead, and that's what the scientists need to work on.
The biggest achievement, of course, was the V-2, which was a technological revolution.
MI6's spies had been reporting these German successes as early as 1943.
Once the Allies had identified Peenemünde as the secret location for the development of these weapons, destroying Peenemünde became a priority, and Operation Hydra went into effect.
Operation Hydra was the Royal Air Force's attempt to destroy Peenemünde and to decapitate the rocket program. The air raid took place on the night of August 18, 1943, and the Royal Air Force launched over 600 bombers against Peenemünde.
The British intelligence decided to destroy not only the facilities, but also researchers in as much numbers as possible.
When Brown had gone to bed, and then right around midnight, the air raid warning started, and so he went into a bunker that was in the research complex. After the people in the bunker said the coast was clear, or it seemed like the air raid was over, he went out and he actually ended up going into his burning office building and rescuing files from the burning building.
Operation Hydra was very costly. 300 men lost their lives that night amongst the air crew, and hundreds, of course, lost their lives on the ground. But sadly, the mean point of attack where the bombs fell was a bit too south. So the laboratories, the weapons development sites were not struck.
The raid against Peenemünde does significant damage, but it only delays production. The Nazis, however, had now been alerted that their secret rocket program has been compromised.
It made it plainly clear to everyone that Peenemünde could no longer be used to manufacture the V-2 rockets. The British caused so much damage at Peenemünde.
It was decided to move to an abandoned mine in the Harz Mountains, which was then called Mittelwerk.
The Allies are relentlessly pushing towards the German heartland, Hitler's Berlin. The capital of the Nazi regime is the ultimate prize. As the German Wehrmacht keeps crumbling in front of the advancing Allies, there is one surprise. The V-2 rockets are still flying. In the month of October alone, there are a total of 91 attacks against England. The Nazis hope the V-2 can still turn the war in their favor.
What was really special about the V-2 was that it could be launched from almost everywhere. There were mobile launchers that were fairly small and fairly easy to handle, and the rocket could be launched from the street, from the forest. There were no special facilities needed to deploy these weapons.
The Allied strategy always had an offensive element to it, using a bombing campaign to destroy the launch sites, and really the Allies were playing a cat-and-mouse game through 1944 and 45 with the mobile launchers.
By now, it's clear that the V-2 is not the miracle weapon Hitler hoped for. But on rare occasions, it hits with devastating accuracy. The worst attack on London is in November 1944. A V-2 hits a crowded Woolworth department store and kills 173 people. James Hamill is a major assigned to U.S. Army Ordnance in the spring of 1945.
James Hamill was a member of the American military, quite young at the time.
He was a junior officer and an engineer, and he reported to Colonel Toftoy. Colonel Toftoy was tasked at the end of the war for gathering up the V-2s and organizing an operation to send the components of 100 missiles to the United States for testing.
The Americans know that the Nazis' new weapons must be powerful if their British allies try to cover up the damage.
When the first weapons started to arrive, they tried to cover up the fact with, reporting gas main explosions and other cover stories to deflect people's interest.
There were mysterious explosions going off in London, and government was denying that there were, that there was a new weapon.
Colonel Toftoy knows that in some categories, the U.S. is years behind in weaponized technology. What the Americans will need is a plan to extract German weapons expertise and German scientists as soon as the fighting on the ground allows.
I understand, sir.
And one of the men involved in this plan will be the young officer, James Hamill. On the ground, the Allies are relentlessly pushing forward. From the west, from the south, and from the east. German forces are being pushed back by massive Allied advances. Now, the sheer strength of troops, manpower alone, paired with the superior war machinery, proves to be insurmountable for Hitler's Third Reich.
No German leader who in his right mind could have seen anything but disaster coming. Hitler was deep in denial that the war was about to be lost.
But still, the V-2s keep coming. 141 attacks on British soil in December alone. And Antwerp, Belgium is now targeted with over 1,000 rockets. Still, Hitler demands even more V-2s.
The war effort became more and more desperate and more hopeless. Parallel to that, the projected numbers of missiles to be produced, the numbers envisioned were absolutely unrealistic.
It's almost Christmas. While soldiers are dying on the battlefields, Werner von Braun and some of his colleagues have gathered at a remote castle for a very special holiday celebration. Hitler still sees von Braun's wonder weapon as his last hope to defeat the advancing Allies. And so the German Führer sends his armaments minister Albert Speer to honor essential V-2 personnel, General Walter Dornberger, Armaments Representative Heinz Kunze, Mittelwerk Director George Rickey, and Werner von Braun himself, awarding them all with the highest medal of the Nazi Reich, the Knight's Cross.
Von Braun was still seen as the guy who could pull off the V-2 program. And so Albert Speer, the armaments ministry, was supporting him. And so as a result of Speer's support, von Braun did get the Knight's Cross in December 1944. There's a very interesting story behind that, because in spring of 1944, von Braun had been arrested by the Gestapo. and had been investigated for remarks he made at a party in which he said they thought the war was lost and that they'd rather build a spaceship. He and two of his old buddies were arrested. Von Braun's brother was arrested. Although he was an SS officer and had been enjoined the SS in 1940 at the request of the SS, von Braun worked intensively on the V2 in spite of seeing the horrible abuse of concentration camp prisoners. Really was no longer entirely trustworthy to the Nazi leadership after the arrest. And so it depends on who was you were talking about. The Armament Minister Albert Speer still supported him, whereas the Heinrich Himmler SS chief was suspicious of him.
Meine Herren, dürfte ich Sie bitten, sich zu erheben? Lieber Herr von Braun, wie wir alle hier in diesem Raum wissen, haben Sie sich verdient um die deutsche Sache gemacht. Wir alle in Berlin sind sehr stolz und dankbar für Ihre Arbeit. Und deswegen, lieber Werner, hat sich der Führer dafür entschieden, Ihnen das Ritterkreuz für Ihre Dienste am Reich zu überreichen. Ich erhebe das Glas auf Werner von Braun.
The Knight's Cross was the highest award given by Nazi Germany for military bravery and for leadership. So that was an indication that the Nazis still clung to the hope that the V2 might mean a new decisive quality of war.
The man who first wanted to reach for the moon has reached a high rank in the Nazi Reich instead.
The photographs that survived the war show a beaming, ecstatic von Braun. There is no sheepish look on the man's face. He is clearly glad to be there.
Aber damit nicht genug. Wir haben zu Ehren von Werner von Braun ein kleines Feuerwerk. Meine Herren.
As a spectacular highlight, Speer orders V2 launches outside for the celebration. The V2 rocket has proven to be an unpredictable but sometimes deadly new weapon.
The V2 was a ballistic missile. It could travel 200 miles in 5 minutes. It came in with no warning. So the lack of defense certainly made it a unique situation.
With no plan of defense, the British decide that their best option is to use intelligence. A government-wide counterintelligence program named Double Cross could be a solution to the threat.
Double Cross was the code word for the fact that the British had captured German secret agents that the Nazis had tried to infiltrate into Britain. The British could use them to send information to Berlin, information that they wanted, deceptive information.
The Germans rely almost exclusively on their spies in London to verify the accuracy of the V2 attacks. One of the spies with this current mission is a man with the code name Agent Tate.
Agent Tate, the Dane called Wolf Schmidt, is one of these allegedly German agents, of course, who the British have captured.
Agent Tate has revealed that his Nazi handlers cabled him that his reports about V2 targeting are so important they might even decide the outcome of the war. Where his loyalty lies could change everything.
I don't know whose side you're on!
MI6's Reginald Jones, together with his counterintelligence colleagues of MI5, devises a plan that he hopes will save London from the V2 attacks.
It's priestly.
Eventually, Tate agrees to switch sides. And the plan goes into action.
We got hits here, 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 and here. In Greater London, nobody's safe.
If Agent Tate succeeds, the Nazis will believe they've improved their aim and caused more damage, when in fact, they actually will have been shifted off track and are hitting more remote locations.
If we manage to shift their targeting
To hear, perhaps. We will save thousands of lives. They have no way to verify where their rockets land.
On the ground, the war continues relentlessly. The most lethal last few months of World War II have begun.
Every situation in Germany by the beginning of 1945 was dire.
The Allies consolidated pretty much along the Rhine, and what was left of Germany was between the Rhine and the Oder for the most part.
By that time in the war, Germany did not have the resources or the manpower to really carry on.
I think Hitler knew very well the war was lost, but he could never say that. And every day he got up and tried to convince himself that there would be a miracle, that they would turn things around. The idea that the various wonder weapons and other new exotic things were coming were there.
Hitler still desperately wants to believe the V-2 can help save Nazi Germany. In January of the year before, only 140 rockets were produced a month. But now, the underground V-2 factory can turn out almost 700. And the Führer's goal is more than triple that amount of vengeance weapons.
Mittelwerk was the underground site of V-2 production, a former mine near Nordhausen.
The V-2 is one of the most expensive weapons used in the war, but there is a far greater cost: the lives of the slave workers who manufactured the weapon.
At the cost of tens of thousands of lives, this mine that was not fit for human occupation was turned into a high-tech production line. Slave labor was used to make the mine somewhat habitable and then to man the production line.
The V-2 that killed maybe 5,000 people in actual attacks, but 10 to 20,000 died in production, so ultimately it killed a lot more people producing it than it was as a weapon.
They were mostly Russian, Polish, Ukrainian, and French prisoners of war.
The first slave laborers who were brought in fell like flies.
Mining the rest of the tunnel that had been unfinished, moving the equipment into place. So they were overworking the prisoners, they were not feeding them, there was a huge problem with sanitation, with lice, and so there were massive epidemics of diarrhea, of typhus, and other diseases among the prisoners.
Daraus geht eindeutig hervor, mehr ist nicht zu schaffen. Wir sind schon an einer absoluten Kapazitätsgrenze. Speer kann nicht immer neue Forderungen stellen, dann soll uns neue Arbeitskräfte schicken, frische.
New concentration camps were built near Mittelwerk to provide the factory over 19,000 slave laborers. Werner von Braun himself visits the Mittelwerk factory no less than 12 times during the war.
Von Braun was extensively familiar with all of these conditions.
And it was not that they just tolerated these people, they actually asked the SS for these people.
We have a document signed by him which details that. He would calculate numbers of concentration camp inmates which would be needed.
For each operational V-2 rocket that rolls off the assembly line, 6 slave workers die.
Von Braun was fully aware of what was going on. Full depths of that, I'm not sure, but certainly he's well aware that the conditions were murderous.
Abuse by SS personnel is rampant. There are hangings of prisoners as punishment for sabotage or resistance.
At that time, there is no indication of any moral dilemma. These engineers who had developed a high sense of professional competence were far from having developed a comparably high code of ethics.
By March of 1945, the Allies have conquered Cologne and are about to cross the Rhine River. Hitler is outraged. Though the majority of V-2s miss their target, Hitler still orders more attacks, and sometimes they hit with fatal accuracy.
The V-2 was an indiscriminate weapon, but when it found the right target, it could be very deadly. V-2 struck at Smithfield's Market and Hughes Mansion. In each of these cases, it killed well over 100 people in one instant.
But eventually, the V-2s start hitting less populated areas of London, as the Germans are adjusting their targeting based on Reginald Jones's method of deception.
Agents like Tate were used to feed the Germans disinformation, both to reinforce the fact that their targeting was accurate, which it wasn't, but also to move their attack away from London.
This strategy has saved the lives of an estimated 11,000 Londoners. And when the Western Allies break through the Rhine front in March, the V-2 attacks finally stop. Hitler's wonder weapon has failed. And with the war almost won, the resources of the German program will be up for grabs. Now, the Allies are racing against each other.
All the Allies scrambled to find as many of the scientists who'd been behind a lot of the Nazi secret weapons. And sometimes this competition, East and West, became quite fierce, but it even took place between the Western Allies. So the French, the British, and the Americans were all trying to get German scientists and gather their documents.
Who will get the German documents, the rocket materials, and the German researchers themselves? The war is coming to an end. Werner von Braun, the head of Hitler's V-2 rocket program, is preparing for the time after the war.
When it became apparent that all was lost and that eventually either the Soviet army or the American army would reach Mittelwerk, von Braun and his colleagues packed up the crucial technical documents from the production program and hid them in a cave. And that was potentially part of their bartering power with whoever got hold of them.
Two of von Braun's closest confidants have brought truckloads of V-2 documents to an abandoned mine shaft. Their crew must hide these 14 tons of technical documents. And the race for the V-2s and the German rocket scientists is on. Technology and personnel that will be post-war game changers.
So Mittelwerk was a target of the Americans, of the Soviets, of the British. Mostly by April 1945, it was a race between the Soviets and the Americans.
The U.S. Army has discovered Mittelwerk and sends forces to liberate the area.
What they were shocked by was the human tragedy of the camp.
Werner von Braun and his team of rocket engineers decide to wait out the war in quite different surroundings.
In fear of being captured by the Soviet army, who they believed quite rightfully would not be as warmly welcoming as the American army, they fled to Bavaria.
The engineers wait for the Americans in a cozy Alpine hotel.
In general, they tried to surrender to the United States if possible. Mostly they thought the United States was the most likely to have the money to support them in the future or continue to work and be the least vengeful. They expected serious resentment on the part of the British, French, and Soviets for good reason.
Wernher von Braun is quoted as having said at the end of the Second World War, "My country has lost 2 world wars. This time I want to be on the side of the victors."
Seinem Befehlsstand in der Reichskanzlei bis zum letzten Atemzuge kämpfend für Deutschland gefallen ist.
When the news of Hitler's death came over the radio, they sent von Braun's younger brother, Magnus, down the hill on a bicycle looking for the American forces. So Magnus von Braun sort of ran into a patrol and had this conversation with this private from Wisconsin.
My brother invented the V2 rocket. We are staying in a hotel on the mountains, 5 kilometers. We want to surrender.
And after a while, he convinced these privates, these ordinary soldiers, that he wasn't crazy and the V2 scientists were actually up on the hill.
Let's go.
Von Braun and his best scientists and engineers surrender to the U.S. 44th Infantry Division. At Mittelwerk, the Americans could also collect the spare parts of the V2 program. Weeks later, after the first wave of troops arrives, one of these Americans is James Hamill, who has been sent to retrieve as much material as possible.
Special Mission V2 was this attempt to recover 100 V2s for testing in the United States. And they had to do that before the Soviets came in, because the Soviets are supposed to move forward and occupy the Mittelwerk.
Guys, we're done here. Find a way to pack it. We don't have much time.
Hamill and his men need to ship these parts to America before the Russians arrive.
And basically, they build up rail cars full of spare parts as well as incomplete missiles.
At Mittelwerk, they pack up over 300 train cars of materials. But the Americans still need von Braun's documents to know how to put the pieces together. Wernher von Braun has hidden secret V2 production documents in a mine near Mittelwerk. The Americans are on the hunt for von Braun's stash of information, but they need to locate it before the Russians or the British find it first.
An American officer basically tricked someone who was up near the Mittelwerk, who had been captured up there, into admitting the location of the mine. And thinking that, basically told the guy, well, we already know where the documents are, can you just help us find them? So the guy was tricked into saying this.
And with the location revealed, all the Americans have to do is pick up the documents.
And apparently, this actually took place just at the moment when the British were putting up their roadblocks, because that was in the British zone of occupation. But the U.S. took the documents out and got them into its own possession.
It is crucial information that will help America in the future to develop its own ballistic missile program and eventually even fly to the moon. But even though the Americans already have von Braun's documents, they know they need von Braun himself. Several months before, none other than the Allied Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower personally cables Washington.
On September the 18th, von Braun, 6 other people from Peenemünde, and 9 other Germans who were going to work for the U.S. Army Air Forces got on a plane and came to the United States.
Despite the State Department's objections of letting Nazi scientists and potential war criminals into the United States without a thorough background check, the U.S. Army insists that von Braun and his men received temporary work permits in the United States.
They underwent some interrogation, but it was pretty pro forma and lax. Von Braun's SS affiliations would have been a tremendous red flag swept under the rug. So the process of bringing von Braun and his colleagues to the United States was streamlined from the very beginning, and whatever obstacles were in the way were dealt with largely on a political basis.
And the man who is going to shepherd von Braun inside the U.S. is none other than James Hamill, who had raided the V-2 missile factory in Mittelwerk only a few months earlier.
His papers are all in order. Special permission, Operation Overcast.
Operation Overcast would later become known as Operation Paperclip and allow over 1,500 German scientists to come and work for the U.S. military.
Actually, the war wasn't over in 1945. The next enemy was right by its side, the Russians. And the US felt that they were in strong competition with the Russians regarding new technologies.
Let's go.
Hamill rounded them up in Boston and brought them to Fort Bliss in New Mexico. So Hamill's job essentially to be the officer directly responsible for them.
Braun.
Von Braun goes to work for the Americans.
His day job was to work on military missile application. But he was hopeful for the United States being the place where he could develop a new program and also ultimately go into space. So he was obsessed with space travel, and he continued to believe in that and hope for the United States.
Eventually, he becomes the head of the Saturn rocket program at a newly founded government agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. And in this capacity, he meets a young American president only 17 years after building the rocket that was supposed to win World War II for Adolf Hitler.
Von Braun's past came back to haunt him gradually. In the 50s, about the only question anyone asked was he a member of the party? And he had to say yes, but he always said, you know, I was never really an enthusiast and I didn't really want to join. And in the 60s and 70s, you began to get a controversy about the Mittelwerk, about the prisoners, and about the SS officer status. But he died in 1977 of cancer at age 65. And so he essentially missed the worst of the controversy, which took place after he was dead.
But before his death, von Braun leaves behind a legacy at NASA.
The team of former Peenemünde engineers headed by Wernher von Braun, which would in effect build the moon rocket in 1969, would launch the Apollo mission successfully to the moon.
Wernher von Braun has fulfilled his dream.
When I was 17 and started all this, the moon looked a lot closer to me than it did for a long, long time in between.
He wanted to reach for the stars. Unfortunately, he developed new forms of death and destruction.
Today it looks again very close.
So basically, Wernher von Braun was not above making a deal with the devil.
I think somehow space flight for the first time gives mankind a chance to become immortal.
And so he is immortal, a flawed man whose ruthless ambition allowed mankind to set foot into space. The controversial program of Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to America, but it also led to giant leaps for mankind. The technology behind the V-2 fueled American journeys to space, a frontier that is still being explored today.